When you mention the word nomad, Scythians, Huns, and Mongols immediately come to mind, and it seems that their era ended along with the Middle Ages when most states had already become settled. They built cities, collected taxes, and created bureaucracy and European-style armies. And yet, in the 17th century, contrary to the logic of the times, Eurasia gave birth to another formidable power. It relied on a nomadic way of life, traditional military mobility, fought against China, and managed to impose its will on half of the steppe world. This was the Dzungar Khanate, the last major nomadic empire, which managed to achieve impressive successes in an era when the very idea of a nomadic state was already considered a thing of the past. And today we will find out who the Dzungars were, how they united into a Khanate, why they became a threat to all their neighbors, and why this state collapsed in just a few years. Greetings to everyone on the Amazing History channel. Thank you for watching, being interested in history, and supporting the release of new episodes. Special thanks to our sponsors. It's your support that allows us to create videos like this one. Now let's get to the topic of this episode. Let's go. To understand where the Dzungar Khanate came from, we first need to figure out who the Oirats were. After all, the Dzungars were not a separate people, but a political name that appeared later. The people who created Dzungaria had called themselves Oirats for centuries. That's why the story of the state inevitably begins with them. The Oirats are Western Mongols who, as early as the 13th century, held a special place in the structure of the Mongol Empire. Their position was based on the Dzungars' status, following the military rule of dividing the army into left and right wings. The Oirats made up the left flank of Genghis Khan's army, and this made them one of the strike forces of the empire. The rulers of the Oirats traced their lineage from Kasar, the blood brother of Temujin, which gave them prestige and closeness to the elite, but did not make them heirs to the Chinggisid dynasty. This is an important nuance that will later play a significant role. After the collapse of the Mongol state, the Oirats became one of the few steppe peoples who managed to maintain their independence. While the Eastern Mongols were trying to hold on to power in central Mongolia, the Oirats were gradually turning into an independent political force with their own goals and ambitions. By the 15th century, they were already conducting their own foreign policy, waging wars with their neighbors, forming alliances, and trying to expand their influence. It was during this period that Essen, the Oirat ruler from the Koros clan, emerged and was the first to try to turn their alliance into a full-fledged state. His successes turned out to be short-lived, but they showed that the Oirats were capable of acting as a unified force. By the 16th century, the Oirat world was divided into several centers, and each of them developed in its own way. In this era, neighboring states were becoming increasingly centralized and had far more resources. In eastern Mongolia, the Khalkha Khanate was gradually gaining power. Mogulistan was disintegrating and fragmenting. The Kazakhs were going through the complex process of forming the three Juzes, while Moscow and China were confidently moving towards each other through Siberia, the Ecumene. At that moment, the Oirats were too strong to be absorbed by their neighbors, but too fragmented to impose their own rules on them. Conflicts between clans constantly flared up within the Union, old ties were weakening, and common interests were becoming blurred. Some groups migrated far to the west, to the place where the Kalmyk Khanate would later emerge, while others moved further south to the Kokono region, creating their own principalities. Those who remained between the Altai, the upper reaches of the Irtysh, and the valley became increasingly dependent on whether they could stay together. It was these territories that gradually turned into what would become Dzungaria. Geography played a role no less important than political ambitions. The area between the Altai, Tarbagatai, Semirechye, and eastern Turkestan was both protected and convenient for control. From here, roads led to Mongolia, Siberia, Central Asia, and China. Whoever held this hub could dictate terms to their neighbors, and the Oirats understood this. By the end of the 16th century, the Oirats increasingly felt the need for unified leadership. There were too many threats, and if they had continued to live in scattered uluses, their fate would have been the same as that of most steppe tribes of that era. Either gradual disappearance or assimilation. Against this backdrop, those rulers who sought to reunite the Oirat lands stood out especially. The first attempts did not lead to a lasting result, but they created an important precedent. the idea of unification began to be seen not as a dream, but as a necessity. It was this idea that later made it possible to establish central authority in the hands of the Koros clan and bring to the historical stage the first figure who can be called the founder of Dzungaria. At the beginning of the 17th century, it was the leader of the Koros clan, Khara Hulataishi, who managed to take on the role of unifier and lay the foundations of the future state. He strengthened his power over neighboring Ulysses, brought scattered nomadic groups under control, and tried to build a stable system of governance. But the main architect of the new state was his son, Batur. It was during his rule that a turning point occurred, which historians consider the starting point of Dzungaria's existence. Batur not only inherited power, but also received recognition from the religious authority, the Dalai Lama, who granted him the title of Kuntaiji. And in the steppe world, such recognition was extremely important, because it legitimized his leadership and gave him the status of a ruler, not just the eldest among equals. Now, for the Oirats, Buddhism was becoming not just a religion, but a unifying ideology capable of keeping the scattered clans within a single political system. Under Batur, the Oirat Union ceased to be a loose confederation. Systematic work began on creating a state with clear laws of governance and military organization. The famous Code of Rules, Ikzasagbichik, or the Great Steppe Code, appeared. This was not a formal collection of traditions, but a real code of laws regulating everything from military service to tax obligations and religious discipline. For the nomadic world, this was an exceptional rule. Oirats created what was essentially codified state law, and this sharply distinguished them from most steppe societies. Batur's foreign policy developed just as actively as his domestic policy. He strengthened his hold on future Dzungaria, expanded into neighboring lands, and clashed with the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Mogulistan rulers. In these clashes, a key trait of the future Dzungaria was revealed: the determination to act offensively, impose its will, and strive for expansion. The Khanate had just emerged, but it was already claiming the role of the dominant power in Central Asia. It was during this period that the Oirats received the name by which they would go down in history. The word Dzungars is connected to their military position in the ancient Mongolian system, the left wing, or Dzungar. Gradually, it turned into a political name, signifying not a tribal union, but a new statehood. From this moment on, we can speak not just about the Oirats, but about the Dzungar Khanate, which has a ruler, laws, territories, and ambitions. After the death of Batur, a decade begins that can be called the golden age of the Dzungar Khanate. It is during this period that the state transforms from a religious force into a major player in Central Asia. However, this rise was neither peaceful nor steady. On the contrary, it was built on sudden surges of personal power and constant conflicts both with neighbors and within the Oirat nobility itself. Even with Batur's predecessors, it becomes clear how important the ideological and administrative foundations he laid turned out to be. The laws created during his reign made it possible to keep power in the hands of the central administration, even when individual clans tried to play their own game. And Buddhism, with its network of monasteries and the authority of the Tibetan Lamaist clergy, became the backbone that kept different Oirat leaders within the same political sphere. But the real rise of Dzungaria is connected with the figure of Galdan Boshoktu. His biography itself reflects the complexity of that era. Galdan spent his youth in Tibet, in monasteries, where he was preparing to become a religious figure, not a military ruler. He received a spiritual education, a title, and probably saw the world differently than most chieftains. But fate commanded him to return to the steppe. The death of his elder brother drew him into a struggle for power, and Galdan was forced to leave monastic life and lead the Oirats. His rule became the moment when Dzungaria first tried to turn its ambitions into a project on the scale of all Central Asia. Galdan possessed both religious charisma, political will, and a toughness that allowed him to act without hesitation against those who resisted. He started by consolidating power within the country, suppressed his rivals, subdued the dissenting clans, and made the power of the Kuntaiji unprecedentedly strong. Galdan's military activity covered vast territories in Central Asia, and his campaigns became some of the most destructive in the entire history of the region. He reached Sairam, took control of a significant part of Semirechye, blocked the migration routes for the Kazakhs, and devastated the regions of Mogulistan. The war was waged not only for plunder, it was accompanied by the imposition of Lamaism and the desire to subjugate the local elites to Dzungar authority. For Galdan, the political and the spiritual did not exist separately. After successful campaigns in the west, he returned to the east. Galdan believed that uniting the Mongol lands under the rule of Dzungaria was a natural step. However, this inevitably led to a confrontation with the Qing Empire, which at that time was actively strengthening its control over Mongolia. The first clashes showed that the Dzungar army was skilled. The effective use of cavalry, maneuverability, firearms, and discipline under the leadership of an educated ruler made it one of the most capable military forces in the region. But the Qing's resources were far greater. The years of struggle exhausted Dzungaria, and Galdan found himself in the position of a leader who managed to conquer much but could not hold on to what he had achieved. The last campaign against the Qing ended in defeat, and Galdan himself, finding himself in a hopeless situation, chose not to fall into the hands of the enemy. After the turbulent and controversial rule of Galdan Boshoktu, the Dzungar Khanate needed a completely different type of ruler, not a field warrior monk, but a shrewd administrator capable of strengthening the state from within and preventing it from clashing with much more powerful neighbors. Such a person was Dzungar. He came to power at a time when Dzungaria was exhausted by wars and its main opponents, the Qing Empire and the Kazakh Juzes, were only growing stronger. Continuing Galdan's policies would have meant imminent disaster, and Dzungar understood this better than anyone. He sharply reduced external aggression in the east, building relations with the Qing that could be described as a cautious balance between recognizing their power and maintaining his own independence. His diplomacy was calculated. The time gained through the truce with the Celestial Empire allowed him to focus on the internal affairs of Dzungaria. He improved the economy, strengthened governance, and modernized the army, and it was here that Dzungar did what perhaps saved the Khanate from destruction for another generation. One of the key directions was the reform of the military. Even during Galdan's time, the Oirats used firearms, but Dzungar decided to take this tool to a whole new level. The Dzungar army was gradually turning into a hybrid of nomadic tradition and European technologies. The decisive moment was the arrival of the Swedish sergeant Johann Gustav Renat in the Khanate. The fate of this man deserves a separate film adaptation. First, he was captured by the Russians at Poltava, then he was sent to Tobolsk, and later he was taken prisoner by the Dzungars after their attack on a Russian convoy. Renat turned out to be a man of exceptional abilities. He set up artillery production, trained local craftsmen to cast cannons, made blueprints, built fortifications, and essentially created the first truly modern artillery army school among the nomadic peoples. The light cannons, which could be transported on camels, made the Dzungar troops unpredictable, since the enemy could no longer rely solely on numbers and maneuvering. The reforms appeared to be more than weapons. Dzungar strengthened the administrative system, reinforced the role of Batur's laws, developed trade with the Russian Empire, and supported monasteries, turning them into ideological and educational centers. Under his rule, Buddhism finally took shape as a pillar of statehood. The monastic network provided not only spiritual legitimacy for the authorities, but also discipline, information gathering, support for diplomacy, and even personnel training. At the same time, on the western borders of the Khanate, Dzungar continued to pursue a tough policy. One of the key directions was the struggle for power over eastern Turkestan, where he actively intervened in the confrontation between the Kashgar and Yarkand rulers. He sought to make them dependent on Dzungaria and thereby strengthen his influence over the caravan routes. At the same time, he increased pressure to the northwest on the Yenisei Kyrgyz, who lived in the region known in the Oirat tradition as Kongurai, the inhabitants of the Minusinsk basin of the Upper Yenisei and the surrounding areas. It was here, during the reign of Dzungar, that an event occurred which the Siberian peoples remembered as a national tragedy. The Dzungars, following the ancient steppe practice of suppressing resistance, organized the mass deportation of the population deep into Dzungaria. For the Oirat elite, such actions were considered a way to secure the border. By removing their rebellious clans from their land, they deprived them of the ability to resist or to form alliances with enemies, especially with the Qing Empire. For the Kyrgyz themselves and other local groups, this became a dramatic turning point, a violent separation from their native lands, which left a mark in legends and caused deep demographic losses. After the deportation of the Yenisei Kyrgyz, it became clear that the Dzungar policy toward their neighbors was moving in a direction that could be described as a strategy of intimidation. The Dzungars sought to deprive their opponents of the ability to resist in the future. Resettlements, forced campaigns, blocking of nomadic routes, and massive military campaigns, all of these gradually became tools that the Khanate used. If in the Siberian lands such tactics affected individual tribal groups, then in Central Asia their consequences reached an unprecedented scale. Very soon, Dzungaria would strike a blow that would change the fate of the entire region. When the Dzungarian troops began their offensive on the lands of the Kazakh Juzes, this was neither a random campaign nor a sudden outburst of aggression. On the contrary, the campaign was a logical continuation of the policy that Dzungaria pursued under Tsevan Narabdan. The Kazakhs controlled rich winter pastures, important trade points, and access to the Siadaria, all of which were critically important for a nomadic state. Dzungaria sought to turn this region into its permanent zone of influence, and by the early 1720s, this ambition became especially clear. Dzungaria was on the rise, while the Kazakh Juzes, on the contrary, were experiencing a period of disunity. This created perfect conditions for a major strike. What happened in 1723 to 1725 remained forever in Kazakh memory as Oktaban Shubirundi, which translates as the years of great disaster. It is difficult to determine the exact scale of the campaign, but sources agree on the main point. The extent of the destruction was unprecedented. The Dzungar troops captured cities, blocked nomadic routes, took people captive, destroyed villages, and seized livestock. Syrom was captured and devastated, coming under the strongest pressure. Tashkent, as well as many regions of Turkestan, were deserted. Streams of refugees fled to the south and west, leaving empty steppes behind them. For Kazakh society, which was already in a state of internal instability, this blow turned out to be catastrophic. People lost their families, land, livestock, everything that was life for a nomad. Researchers often compare this time to a real civilizational crisis. Demographic losses, the destruction of the economy, and the displacement of entire clans for decades reshaped the social map of the region. But the tragedy was not limited to the Kazakhs, Karakalpaks, Uyghur communities, certain groups of Kyrgyz, and the population of the cities of Central Asia also suffered. Some cities were forced to acknowledge dependence on Dzungaria. Others bought peace at the cost of huge payments, and Dzungar influence spread farther than ever before. However, despite the impressive success, this victory turned out to be deceptive. It overloaded the resources of the Khanate and worsened relations with almost all of its neighbors. At the same time, the Dzungars gained vast territories, but they had no way to hold on to them for long. Moreover, the united resistance of the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Uzbek rulers gradually grew stronger and became one of the factors that would later undermine the power of the Oirats in the region. After the rule of Tsevan Rabdan, power passed to his son Galdan Tayland San, who managed to stabilize the Khanate and temporarily stop the destructive wars with the Qing. Under his rule, Dzungaria maintained its status as a strong state even despite being exhausted by previous conflicts, but this stability relied mainly on his personal authority. Therefore, when Galdan Tisran died in 1745, the system he maintained with his personal authority began to fall apart right before everyone's eyes. The main problem was the lack of a clear succession mechanism. The Oirats did not have a definite principle by which power would pass from the Khan to his son or to a specific family line. This meant that each new ruler had not so much to receive power as to hold on to it in competition with other contenders. As long as there was one obvious leader, like Galdan Seren, this mechanism worked, but as soon as he disappeared, the whole structure collapsed from within. His 13th 12-year-old son, Tsevan Dorji, was enthroned, but his rule began in an atmosphere of distrust and tension. In Dzungaria, other figures who considered themselves no less worthy heirs immediately became active. The most prominent among them were two people, Lama Dorji and Davatsi. Both came from respected family lines, and both had supporters among the influential Noyons. The rivalry between them quickly went beyond a personal struggle. It split the nobility, the tribes, and even individual clans. Another contender was Amursana, the Dzungar Noyon, known for his personal charisma, ambition, and ability to maneuver among powerful players. It was under his protection that the future Kazakh Khan, Ablai, spent 2 years in captivity. In general, what was previously seen as a single political structure was now turning into a set of competing groups, each of which saw the future of the Khanate in its own way. Gradually, neighbors began to interfere in what was happening. They keenly sensed the moment when a strong state could be undermined without direct war. Kazakh Khan Abilai was especially active in taking advantage of this. He skillfully used the internal strife among the Oirats, giving refuge to one or another contender, supporting them with resources or people. If this weakened the overall Dzungar front, when Dzungaria became engulfed in the struggle of contenders, the Qing Empire saw the moment that almost all of Russia had been waiting for. For Beijing, the existence of a strong Oirat state was a constant threat. As long as there was strong authority in Kansi, like under Galdan, a direct invasion was risky, but now, with power fragmenting and the nobility splitting, the situation seemed perfectly suitable. The formal pretext for the invasion was Amur Sana's appeal to the Qing for support after he was left out of power due to his break with Dawachi. He made no secret of his desire to regain power in Dzungaria, and he expected that he would become the ruler of the conquered Khanate. For the Qing emperor, such a request was a long-awaited opportunity. The Oirat claimant himself invited them to intervene, which allowed the campaign to be declared not as aggression, but as restoring order. In 1755, a huge Qing army crossed the borders of Dzungaria under the pretext of helping Amur Sana. But already in the first week, it becomes clear that Beijing is pursuing its own goals. The Qing are aiming not just to restore order, but to re-establish full control over the territory of the Khanate. The Chinese quickly seize key centers, disarm the Ulysses, and announce that power in Dzungaria will be distributed at the emperor's discretion. This was the main blow to Amur Sana's ambitions. The emperor appoints him not as the ruler of Dzungaria, but only as the Khan of one small part of the Khanate. Meanwhile, all the real power goes to Dawachi, the very man whom Amur Sana had defeated and fought against. This was not just a disappointment, but a humiliation. Amur Sana realized that he had been used and assigned a secondary role without any real influence. In response, Amur Sana starts an uprising, declaring that he is fighting not only against Dawachi, but also against the Qing. He hoped that the numerous Oirat clans, humiliated by the Qing's interference, would rally under his banner. Some did support him, but his forces were clearly insufficient, and the state was already too fragmented to act as one. For Emperor Qing, Amur Sana's rebellion became the point of no return. In Beijing, they concluded that any attempts to leave Dzungaria as an independent Khanate, even in a formal sense, were doomed. Every new leader would take up arms, and every alliance would turn into betrayal, so Qing shifted from a policy of changing rulers to a policy of completely eliminating the Oirat statehood. Thus begins the second phase of the invasion, which is much harsher and more systematic. From 1756 to 1858, Qing troops systematically combed through the territory of the Khanate, destroying resistance and punishing entire Ulysses. Epidemics, devastation, famine, and mass executions accelerate the process. Sources, both Chinese and European, acknowledge the death of such a large number of Oirat people that it can be described as a demographic catastrophe. Amur Sana, deprived of support, first retreats to the Kazakh Khan Abilai, then to the Russian Empire, where he soon dies of illness. With the disappearance of the last leader capable of uniting the remnants of Dzungaria, by 1758, the last steppe empire ceases to exist with the fall of the Dzungar Khanate. Of course, the history of the Oirats did not end there. The fate of those who survived turned out to be very uneven. Some of the Oirat Ulysses were caught up in the flow of refugees who scattered in different directions, some to the west, some to the south. Some tried to seek refuge with their former enemies, because there was no other choice. The journey was especially dramatic for those who headed towards Central Asia, to Afghanistan, Badakhshan, and Bukhara. The local rulers, who needed military strength, accepted the Oirats into their service, but the price for such protection was high. The resettled Ulysses gradually lost their political independence, blended into the local population, and over time converted to Islam, turning into new ethnic groups. Another direction of exodus was the road back west, to the Volga Kalmyks, but tragedy did not spare the Oirats here either. The fleeing Ulysses moved through impassable steppes and mountain corridors, pursued by Qing detachments. In the collective memory of the Oirats, this route became one of the most tragic episodes. According to legend, about 15,000 young men stayed behind to guard one of the mountain passes, which later became known as the Dzungarian Gate. They held back the pursuers to allow the women, children, and elders to escape. None of them survived. Historical documents do not record a specific battle at this location, but the theme of the mass death of young defenders is deeply rooted in the folklore of the Oirats and Kalmyks. Meanwhile, those who remained in the territory of the former Khanate came under the direct control of Qing China. The empire pursued a policy of resettlement and breaking up the Ulysses, trying to eliminate even the slightest possibility of the revival of Dzungar statehood. Other peoples, including the Khalkha Mongols and Uyghurs, were settled on the vacated pastures. This changed the ethnic map of the region and finally destroyed the territory that had belonged to the Oirats for centuries. However, despite the tragedy of the 18th century, the Oirats did not disappear in Russia. Their descendants became the Kalmyks, a people who still preserve the Oirat language and Buddhist tradition. In Mongolia, the Betas, Zakchins, and Bayats, who trace their origins to the Oirats, have been preserved. In Xinjiang, there are small Oirat communities, the Dzungar Torguts and the Koshuts. They have long been disconnected from the former Khanate, but they still preserve the memory of it as a golden era, when their ancestors ruled the vast steppe and were a force capable of challenging the empire. The fall of the Dzungar Khanate marked the end of the era of nomadic empires. After that, the steppe never played the same role again. In the century B, but the very history of Dzungaria reminds us how complex, diverse, and fragile that world was, where even the strongest powers collapse not from an external blow, but from the moment when harmony within them disappears. That's all from me. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.